The Dreamer by Pam Muñoz Ryan and Peter Sis. Lagoon. Neftali woke from the same nightmare every morning for the next week. Laurita was drowning, and he could not save her because he was drowning too. The horrible visions plagued him, even as he ate breakfast, put on his swimming suit, and walked to the beach. Neftali wondered if the beachcombers they passed each morning puzzled over their strange parade. A cheerful, whistling man, followed by a somber boy, a weeping girl, and a dutiful woman who walked behind as if nothing was wrong. Neftali's resentment shadowed him, preventing him from speaking to Mamadre or father, except to answer their direct questions. His stubbornness came along too. As soon as the torturous swim in the ocean was over, Neftali strode back to the house, changed from his swimming suit, and set out on his own. He was determined to do as he pleased. On a cliff overlooking the ocean, he daydreamed on purpose. He was the flamingo at the edge of the salt marsh, lifting like a giant kite. He was the banished seagull. He was the swan whose curious body seemed to slide on a mirror. When he wasn't daydreaming, he read, on purpose, until he had finished all the books he had brought with him. With the rest of the summer left, he would need to find more. One afternoon, he walked to the small town and asked a shopkeeper about the location of the library. The shopkeeper pointed him toward a lane that ended at someone's home. Thinking the shopkeeper had misunderstood, Neftali asked a woman passing on the street. She smiled and pointed to the same house. As Neftali stood on the front path, wondering how a library could be in someone's home, the door was flung open and a bell tied to the doorknob jingled. A small man, old enough to be Neftali's grandfather, bounded down the steps. Come in, he called. The man had a beard like father's, but with much more gray and eyes that danced. He ushered Neftali into a small room where sawdust blanketed the floor. I am Augusto, the librarian. Neftali held out his hand. I am Neftali. I'm only a visitor for the summer. Augusto grabbed Neftali's hand in both of his. It is of no matter. Any time is an auspicious time for books, no? Neftali nodded. Augusto pulled him closer to the sagging bookshelves. In what may I interest you? Do you like mystery? Do you like the symphony of language? Neftali smiled and nodded on both accounts. Have you already read Jules Verne? Neftali nodded again. But I would read him more than once. And do you know the character Buffalo Bill? Asked Augusto. Neftali's eyes brightened and then clouded. Yes, he was a great horseman, but I did not like how he treated the Indians. Ah, you are a conscientious reader with a taste for adventure. Augusto stepped to the wall of books. He pulled out 2 volumes. One appeared to be for a reader much younger than Neftali, and one for someone much older. It is never too late for this one, said Augusto, handing him an illustrated picture book of Greek myths. Then he handed him A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle. And it is never too early for this one. The front door opened and the bell announced another patron. Come in, said Augusto, leaving Neftali with the books. Neftali ran his fingers over the covers. His eyes scanned the overstuffed yet cozy room. He did not care that he was squandering good weather by staying indoors. He did not care if reading did not make his leg muscles stronger. He did not care if this pastime did not increase his appetite. He curled up in a chair and read all afternoon. It wasn't until the sun was low again, and low enough to stream through the window and hit him in the eyes, that he realized he needed to head back to the summer house. He returned the books to the shelves and then paused in front of a bookcase, his eyes sweeping back and forth over the authors' names. Hugo, Cervantes, Conan Doyle, Baudelaire, Verne, Tolstoy, Ibsen, Apollinaire. Augusto stood up from his desk, where he had been reading, and came over to Neftali. What is the matter, young man? Do you need help? Why do you look so forlorn? Neftali sighed. How will I ever read all of these books in one summer? Augusto laughed. There is always time for that which is truly important. If not this summer, then another. He pulled 4 books off a shelf and held them out to him. I'm only open a few afternoons a week. I hope these will feed you until next time. Neftali looked at the books and smiled. Thank you, but I cannot take them. My father, he does not like me to read when I could be outside. And in the evening, there is little light in the house. Ah, I understand, said Augusto. I had a father with the same mind. He walked to the window and looked out, then turned back to Neftali and held up one finger. What you need is un escondite, a hideout. Neftali's face brightened. Augusto signaled for him to come to the window. He pointed outside to a road bordered by trees. A mile down, there is an abandoned cottage that might serve you. He held the 4 books out to Neftali. But what if someone comes, said Neftali. Although there was no one else in the room, Augusto cupped a hand around his mouth as if telling a secret. It belongs to me, but I no longer use it. I live here now. He swept his arm around the shelves, with my neighbors who reside among the pages. Neftali bit his lower lip as he considered the offer. He nodded and took the books. Thank you. He hurried from the house, the bell on the door jingling behind him. Outside, he leapt down the path and then turned to wave to the grinning Augusto at the window. Alongside the road, the trees eventually gave way to tall sea grass, and the grass to rocky dirt and low dunes. Neftali finally came to a dirt drive. The land sloped downward toward a white slatted cottage covered in honeysuckle and gone to disrepair. He ran down the path and jumped onto the porch, arriving breathless. Un escondite, his hideout. Though the windows and doors were boarded and locked, the porch was deep and covered. Near the door, a long wooden box hugged the wall. He lifted the lid to find a few old buckets and garden tools. The books would be safe and dry there. Augusto had been right. This place was perfect. He circled the small house. Behind it, a burst of color appeared from a mound of poppies, blood red, white, purple, black, and orange, blooming in the midst of an overgrown garden. In the middle of the poppies, an old rowboat went to pieces. Neftali ran to the landlocked ship, raised his arms above his head, jumped in the air, and claimed it as his own. How could one little piece of earth fill him with such joy? Beyond the garden, a narrow path stretched toward a lagoon. Neftali hurried to the water, where 2 black-necked swans glided in the middle. As he approached, they turned and paddled toward him, their long necks stretching outward and their bills open in anticipation. So then, Mr. and Mrs. Swan, someone has treated you as pets, no? And you are expecting a bite of food? The swans made hollow wheezing sounds. Tomorrow, he promised. I will be back tomorrow. Of that you can be certain. As the sun eased toward the horizon, Neftali headed back to the summer house. In the waning light, he ran, his thoughts beating. My books, my cottage, my swans. My books, my cottage, my swans. He couldn't wait to return tomorrow. Now, if only he could keep the cottage a secret. From what are the walls of a sanctuary built, and those of a prison? The next day, the minute the swim was over, Neftali hurried back to the summer house, changed, and hoped to leave for the cottage before the others arrived. In the rustic kitchen, he quickly stuffed bread into his pockets and scooted out the door, but he came face to face with Laurita. He looked behind her to see Madre and father slowly making their way down the hill. Why are you back so soon? He asked. Don't you usually stay and play on the beach? I was cold and wanted to come home. Where are you going? Just exploring, he said, avoiding her eyes. I want to come with you, she pleaded. Porfa, it is so boring here. Every day I must go to the market with my madre. Then I must take a nap. Then I must play alone and not make noise while they take coffee. And then, Neftali interrupted her. Maybe some other time. For now, I am busy. He ran off, glancing over her shoulder to make sure that Laurita had stayed behind. She stood near the house, watching him, her shoulders sagging. It wasn't any easier the next afternoon. The minute Neftali left the beach, Laurita ran after him all the way to the house and changed her clothes as quickly as he did. "Neftali," she whined, watching him in the kitchen. "Why do you stuff bread in your pockets? And what is that beneath your shirt?" She lifted his shirt tail. It is your sheep. Where are you taking it? Where are you going? I promise to be good if you take me with you." He ignored her and pushed out the door, but she followed him. Abruptly, he turned. "Laurita, go back!" As if he had slapped her, she stopped, dropped her head, turned around, and walked back to the house. Her shoulders shook, and Neftali knew she was crying. Guilt tugged at him, but if he took her, there was the chance she might accidentally tell Madre or father about the cottage and the books. He did not want any of his discoveries to be forbidden, and he didn't want the responsibility of Laurita either. By the end of the week, Laurita did not even ask to come along. She just tearfully watched him go. When Neftali reached the edge of the lagoon, the swans waited. He tossed bread to them and they busily raced for each piece. "I have a secret to tell you. Laurita follows me. I saw her. She does not come to the cottage, though. She only comes to the dirt drive and then goes away. Do not worry. She cannot see much from there. And she would not betray me on purpose." Neftali sat down on the bank. "The morning swim does not get better. When I wake, my stomach's already sick with fear. Laurita cannot swim well, and I worry I will lose her to the greedy waves. I love sitting on the sand and watching the sea and collecting what is on the shore, but I do not like that the water is so dark. I cannot see beneath it or how quickly it changes its mind to send me one way or the other. Do you want to know another secret? I always think that I'm going to die." The two swans preened each other's long necks. "Father says I will get stronger, but I do not. And that is making him angrier every day. When I finally come out of the waves, I am shaking and blue from the cold. I even wait to put a blanket over myself so that Father can see my suffering. But it does no good. My Madre says nothing. Nothing. And that makes me angrier. I only talk when I must. I do not even want to be with them. I am happiest when I am here with you." Neftali picked up the book that Augusto had lent him the day before. He lay back on the bank and held it above his head. "Now, are you ready to hear a little Victor Marie Hugo? Listen to this, my friends." "My love flowed e'er for things with wings, when boy I sought for forest fowl, and caged them in rude rushes mesh, and fed them with my breakfast roll, so that, though fragile were the door, they rarely fled, and even then would flutter back at faintest call." Neftali sat up and tossed the remainder of the bread into the lagoon. "I will feed you my breakfast roll, and hope that if you ever flee, you too will come back to my call." The swan swam to his offerings and then rushed back for more. "Do not be greedy," said Neftali, "and stay in the shadows of the bank. Augusto said that there are hunters who arrive this time of year and would kill you if they could. And for what purpose? To make a powder puff from your down? Or to decorate a silly hat with your long feathers?" Neftali watched the two mates swimming together as if one were the shadow of the other. "You are best friends, yes? Always together. I am only a little jealous." He leaned back and listened to the water birds, the screeches of seagulls, the song of the deep-throated cormorant, and the now familiar chirp chirp of the swans. "My swans, is it true what they say? Do you sing El Canto del Cisne, one last song before you die? No, do not tell me the answer to that. It is something I can live without knowing. Hide in the tall grass, my friends, so the hunters cannot find you." Neftali walked back to the cottage and sat on the porch, surveying his summer museum. fish bones, shells, crab claws, sea glass, mother of pearl, and the faithful sheep, all arranged on makeshift shelves of old wooden boards stacked on rocks. Contented that everything was in its place, he leaned against the porch post and continued reading. A few weeks later, when Neftali reached the edge of the lagoon, he waved his arms. "My friends, I am here! Where are you?" He threw a few pieces of bread in the water, but it turned to mush and sank. He called again and then whistled. The swans did not come. The lagoon was strangely quiet. Even the gulls and cormorants had disappeared. Neftali searched the bank, pushing aside the tall grass. He stalked the perimeter of the salt marsh. He tried to convince himself that the swans were safe. Maybe whoever had once fed them had come back. Maybe they were now begging near another property. He decided to walk to a house in the distance and ask about the swans. He turned up a lane and unsure of where it led. It was there that he saw the trail of blood. A sinking feeling enveloped him. He heard a rustling in the bushes and turned toward it. In the muddy reeds, the male swan wobbled. Blood pooled beneath him. For a moment, Neftali's stomach felt as if it might erupt, and he swayed, but a desperate whine from the swan steadied him. Neftali stepped closer and frantically searched for the swan's mate, but she was nowhere. Gently, he stooped and lifted the enormous bird that made no attempt to resist. Neftali struggled to carry him back to the cottage. The swan felt all the heavier because of the weight of Neftali's heart. He laid the swan on the porch, took a bucket from the storage bench, and fetched water from the lagoon. Then he blotted the gash with the corner of his shirt. His voice shook. Misisne, my swan, whoever did this to you is a barbarian." Neftali stroked the bird's neck. "The hunters killed her, didn't they?" He laid his head on the bird's back. "You must eat, or you will die too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out tiny bits of bread and gently nudged them between the swan's orange beak. As the afternoon wore on, Neftali could not bear the idea of leaving the swan. But he did not arrive back at the house on time. He couldn't imagine what father might do or forbidden. But if he did not arrive back at the house on time, he couldn't imagine what father might do or forbidden him to do. He stayed with the swan until the sun was nothing more than a dot on the horizon. Then he raced back to the summer house. As he approached, he saw Laurita playing outside. She stopped and squinted at him, then pointed at his chest. "What happened, Neftali? Are you hurt?" Neftali looked down. His shirt was covered in blood. He groaned, "Oh, no, I'm fine." Frantically, he looked around. "Where are my madre and father?" "Inside, but..." Laurita continued to point at his bloodied shirt. "Laurita, it is not my blood. It is the blood of a swan. I need you to help me." "Help you do what?" "Can you sneak into the house quickly and bring me a clean shirt?" She nodded. "Do not tell my madre and father about the blood." Laurita hesitated. "I won't tell, but only if you take me with you tomorrow." Neftali ran his fingers through his hair. "I will have to ask permission, and father might say no." "But if you ask in a polite way..." Neftali sighed. "Okay then, now hurry." He waited as Laurita skipped into the house. A few minutes later, she returned with a clean shirt. He took off the bloodied one, hid it within a dense bush, and redressed. As the two walked into the house, my madre and father met them. "We are sitting down to dinner soon," said my madre. "Wash your hands," said father, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. Neftali and Laurita washed their hands together in the sink. Like a conspirator, Laurita caught Neftali's eye and smiled. "Thank you," he whispered, praying that Laurita would continue to be sympathetic and not turn into una chismosa, a tattletale. The next morning, on the beach, as soon as the swim in the ocean was behind them, Neftali grabbed Laurita's hand and stood in front of my father and my madre. "Can Laurita come with me today? There is a flamingo's nest that she would like to see. I promised to watch her." "Be sure she stays close to you," said Father. "And do not wait so long to return to the house. Last night you were much too late. I do not want to come looking for the two of you." Naphtali made a mental note to leave the cottage well before sunset. He held Laurita's hand and walked her calmly to the top of the hill. When they were out of their parents' sight, Laurita pulled her hand from his and jumped up and down. "Calm down, Laurita, and listen. When we get to the house, change into your clothes, and then find some old rags and a blanket. I will get bread from the kitchen." "What are they for?" "I will explain everything when we are on our way. Right now we must hurry." While they walked on the road toward the cottage, Naphtali told Laurita everything about Augusto, the hideout, the lagoon, the swans, and the hunters. Every few moments, Naphtali paused and said, "And you must not tell anyone." Each time, Laurita nodded earnestly. Before they even arrived at the port or laid eyes on the swan, Laurita wrung her hands and repeated over and over, "Pobrecito, pobrecito, poor thing, poor thing." Naphtali found the swan as he had left him, lying in a heap on the porch with his eyes closed. Laurita hovered over him. "He's not dead, is he?" Naphtali reached out and stroked his neck. "No, just sleeping." At his touch, the swan's eyes opened and he trembled, then tried to stand, only to slump back down. "Do not be frightened, my swan," said Naphtali, his voice smooth and calm. "This is my sister, Laurita. In a few days, when you are better, we will go back to the water. I promise. But for now, you must rest." Naphtali looked at Laurita, whose eyes were round and solemn. He nodded toward the bucket. "Bring some water from the lagoon so I can clean him. Then, before we leave, we will fill it with fresh water for him to drink." Laurita retrieved the bucket and rushed to the lagoon and back. While Naphtali wiped the blood from the swan's body, Laurita stroked his head as if he were a baby. The bird closed his eyes. "Do not worry," she said. "We are here now, and we will take care of you. Poor, poor thing." Every day, for 2 weeks, Naphtali and Laurita came to take care of the swan. Laurita brought fresh water and arranged and rearranged the blanket to create a soft nest. Naphtali cleaned his wounds, fed him tiny balls of bread, and encouraged the bird to stand and walk, even though he could only take a few steps before collapsing. And when, at last, the wound healed enough, Naphtali kept his promise. Finally, the day came. Naphtali carried the swan toward the lagoon. Laurita walked beside him, fretting. "Is he safe? Go slow, Naphtali. Careful." When they reached the bank's edge, Naphtali lowered the swan to the ground. "Now what?" asked Laurita. "We must remind him that his home is in the lagoon." He stood over the swan and carefully dipped his bill into the water. Then Naphtali let go of him. For a moment, the swan stayed on the surface, but then he listed into the water, sinking. Laurita screamed, "Naphtali, do something!" Naphtali lunged for the swan and heaved him into his arms. He fell back on the bank, sat up, and cradled him against his chest. "What is the matter, Mr. Swan?" Laurita sat down next to them. "Maybe he will feel better if you tell him all that you can see." Naphtali gave her a tiny smile, recalling the times she had stood at the window for him. He looked out at the lagoon. "I see seagulls standing like soldiers on the sand. In the water, hundreds of flamingos raised their curved beaks. Now they are running and lifting into the wind. Look at them. They form one gigantic creature in the sky, a bird of 1,000 wings. What color are they, you ask? The color of a baby's cheek. There is more. I see cliffs that are too steep to climb, and 2 clouds in a lazy race. Which one will win? I cannot tell." Laurita looked out over the lagoon too. "Naphtali, where are the rest of the swans?" "The hunters must have killed them or frightened them away. When our swan is stronger, we will take him to another spot, maybe to Lake Budi. There are many swans there." Laurita put her hands together in prayer. "He must get better." But even after another week of devoted attention, the swan had made little progress. He seemed to grow weaker and more despondent. On the day that marked 3 weeks since he'd found the swan, Neftali waited at the top of the hill for Laurita to dry off from the morning swim. She finally ran up to him. "I cannot go with you today. My mother says I must go with her to visit someone who is a girl my age. But I don't want to play with a girl I do not know. I want to go with you." "It is all right, Laurita. One day will not make a difference." "There was fish left over from dinner last night. I hid it near the back door in some paper. Maybe he will like it. But only give him teeny tiny bites. Don't forget to get fresh water for him. And make sure to shake the blanket and arrange it around him like I do. And..." Neftali put his hand on her arm. "Laurita, I promise to do everything." Then he hurried away, leaving her, wringing her hands with worry. When Neftali reached the cottage, the swan lifted his head and made a short, pitiful bleat. "You greet me today, Mr. Swan," said Neftali. "I hope that is a good sign." Yet again, he carted the swan to the water, but the weak bird only huddled against the bank as if wanting to rest. Neftali lifted him back into his arms. "Do not worry, my swan. Tomorrow's another day." He trudged up the lane. "You will like the fish Laurita sent you. It will make you stronger. She was sad not to come today, but I'm sure she will be back tomorrow, and we can bring more fish. There's no trouble. And when you feel a little better, then you will swim in the lagoon again. I'll help you. You will see." Neftali slowed. "You feel heavier today. Maybe you're gaining weight. That would be a good sign." He walked forward. "We're almost to the cottage, and I will arrange everything as Laurita instructed. She is a bossy nurse, no?" Above them, a flock of seagulls soared toward the ocean, growing smaller and smaller. "Where are they headed, my friend? Can you tell me what they do so far out over the water?" A cool wind gusted. The seagrass whispered. Neftali took one short step, then another. Almost there." He felt a feathery coolness on his arm. "Yes, rest your head, my friend. Rest your head." The swan's silky neck unfurled, and the life disappeared from his body. Neftali kept walking, his arms aching. Tears brimmed in his eyes and spilled over. He stumbled. "No, not today. Not any day," he whimpered. He reached the porch and sank to the step. How long had it taken him to arrive at the cottage? A minute? A month? A year? It was almost sunset when Laurita and Mamadre found him there, still rocking the swan. Laurita ran to him, sat at his side, put her head on his shoulder, and began to cry. Neftali looked up at Mamadre. "It is not true. It is not true. His mate was killed. A hunter beat him. We took care of him, but today..." Mamadre sat on the other side of Neftali. With her hand, she wiped his tears. "I know. When you did not come, Laurita told me. There was nothing more you could have done. He must have been injured on the inside, too. His wounds healed, but he still seems sad." Mamadre put her arm around Neftali's shoulder. "Wounds are deceiving. Maybe his pain was from something else. A swan needs other swans, just as people need other people." Neftali buried his face in the swan's feathers. Laurita hiccuped through her tears. Mamadre stood, took off her shawl, and spread it on the ground. Then, with strength Neftali did not know she had, Mamadre lifted the swan from his arms, tenderly laid him on the shawl, and folded the fabric over his body. "I will come back with you tomorrow, and we will bury your friend. Can you think of a good spot?" Neftali nodded. "In the poppies." Mamadre pulled Neftali onto her lap and rocked him just as he had rocked the swan. By the time they left the cottage, the sun had disappeared. As they walked home, Neftali held hands with Mamadre and Laurita. It was dark when they finally reached the edge of the yard. Father's shadowy figure moved in the light of a window. Naphtali froze and his voice trembled. Father will be upset. This is all my fault. My madre kneeled in front of them. She put one hand on Naphtali's shoulder and the other on Laurita's. I will say that I took Laurita for a walk. We met up with you, and the lagoon was so beautiful, I decided to stay until sunset. That is why we are so late. My madre looked from Naphtali to Laurita. When we go into the house, go straight to your bedroom. I will tell Father you are both much too dirty to join us. I will bring dinner to you later. Do you understand? Naphtali reached out and hugged my madre's neck tight. He wanted to tell her how much he loved her. He wanted to tell her he was sorry for being angry with her and not talking to her. But his overwhelming emotions stood in the way of his words. There now, let's go inside, she said. But Naphtali wasn't ready to let her go. He needed one more moment. He whispered in her ear, "It is not true what they say." And what is that, my son? A tear ran down his cheek. Swans do not sing when they die. Summer dwindled. Within a few weeks, the yellow sun changed to gold and the shadows lengthened, but the everlasting waves stayed the same, rushing in and sucking back to sea. Naphtali said goodbye to Augusto, packed away all of summer's treasures, and stayed closer to the summer house. He wrote words everywhere, on fence posts, on bleached driftwood, and on the old boats near the shore. On their last days in Puerto Saavedra, Father stood on the beach with his arms crossed. Naphtali and Laurita stood in front of him, their fingers entwined. You have not tried hard enough, Naphtali. After the entire summer, it looks as if you have grown more frail instead of stronger. He has grown taller, that is all, said my madre. And Jose, look at the healthy color in his face. Father ran his hand over his beard, staring at Naphtali. All I see is your foolishness. You are still obsessive. You have not changed one bit, have you? Naphtali stared at the flecks in the sand. I am a better swimmer, offered Laurita. Father ignored her and shook his head. Let us get this over with. In you go. Naphtali tugged Laurita forward and stepped into the water. His stomach recoiled, his fear as intense as it had been on the first day of summer. How could he love a place so much and hate it at the same time? How could the water feel as if it were part of something deep inside of him and at the same time seem so foreign? The water rose. He fought each wave. Thoughts of drowning dragged him down with panic. But when he lost his footing, he did not sink. He kicked his feet, stroked one arm, and pulled Laurita with the other. Kick your legs, Laurita, and push the water with your arm. During a long lull between waves, he found the sand again and looked out. His eyes blurred, and he lifted a hand to shade them. Beyond the swells, an unlikely regatta appeared before him. His fuzzy sheep bobbing on the water, the Mapuche boy backstroking and waving, two swans swimming in tandem, Augusto, the happy castaway, floating on a raft of books without a care in the world, and a rowboat filled with radiant poppies. The next wave crested. Naphtali leaned into it, pulling Laurita with him. Then he searched for the floating parade, but he saw only a blanket of poppies sinking below the surface. Father was already talking about coming back to Puerto Saavedra next summer, and the next one after that. Naphtali did not want to think about how far out he might have to swim when he was older. The next wave pushed him down, separated Naphtali and Laurita's hands, and deposited him in a royal of white water. He held his breath and righted himself, feeling a strange buoyancy, as if something beneath had kept him afloat. Frantically, he lunged for Laurita and scooped her into his arms. Naphtali shook, but not from fear. This time, he trembled from teeth-grinding anger. Father was wrong. He had changed. Naphtali made up his mind. He would come back to Puerto Saavedra, but after today, he would never go into the ocean again, no matter what Father said or did. Naphtali loved the ocean's sound. He loved what the waves delivered. He loved the smell and taste of the salt air, but that was enough. Holding Laurita tight, he made his way to shore. Father shook his head, disgusted, and walked off toward the house. Ma Madre wrapped Laurita in a blanket and herded her away too, to prepare for a long trip home. Without them there, Naphtali lingered. He found a stick and defiantly wrote giant words in the damp sand. Naphtali dropped the stick, feeling a peculiar sense of ownership. He spread his arms and listened to the ocean's thunderous applause. He bowed. The ocean was now his audience. Father's whistle screeched in the distance. Naphtali headed away from the beach. A stone caught his eye. He picked it up. It was smooth, pearl gray, and flat, and shaped like a perfect heart. Nothing he had found all summer was as unique. Naphtali slipped the stone into his pocket. School would start in a few weeks. Maybe he would find the courage to give it to a friend. Maybe even to Blanca. He ran to the top of the hill and looked down. The waves rushed in and out. Little by little, letter by letter, the sea washed the sand clean. Where will the waves take the debris abandoned in the freckled sand? And hear the words that the ocean washed away. Idiot. Amount to nothing. Worthless. Fanatic. Daydreamer. Absent-minded. Dim-witted.